Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. It's great fun to be here. You know, it's always nice to talk to a very interdisciplinary audience, people from many different fields, people from inside science, from outside science, with many different interests. And I figured it might be interesting just to start, you know, given that I speak about the power of questions, to start with a really big question, namely, what's the goal of science? And I think sort of the first thing that at least I tend to think of is, this is about discovering answers. This is about finding out how it works. This is about really getting the facts. But I think that actually has it upside down. This is a top-down way of looking at science. Whereas, of course, if you think about it, what comes before an answer? It's always going to be a question, right? And so really the important thing, the important challenge that everybody who's curious about the world, including scientists, the really important question is, what are the best questions to ask? So this is really about finding the right questions. You know, the one moment I started thinking about this was when I was talking to kids, to an audience of kids aged between 8 and 12, and they asked me some of the most wonderful questions about language. And I started realizing that if you speak only to people from your own discipline, what you get is scholarly questions. You get questions that are informed by the books, the conferences, the talks in your field. And so what that means, scholarly questions are not necessarily bad, but they can easily lead to tunnel vision, and they can easily lead to blind spots. And so one of the things that I like so much about events like this, Nerd Night, or you know, any other kind of interdisciplinary audience or audiences with different ages, is that it forces you to take a step back and think about what are the most important questions we could be asking to better understand the world. Now, what I want to do, though, first is start with a really, really, really tiny question. You could say the tiniest question of all. And this is, of course, the word that Dirk wasn't supposed to mention. And it's the word, huh? It's this little word that we use when we didn't quite catch what somebody just said. I was, you know, in the line for the drinks just now, and I heard someone using it. And you know, once you start listening to it, you hear it everywhere. It's terrible, actually. You know, this is what my job has brought me. I hear them everywhere. Don't go into linguistics. Do though. It's hugely interesting. But so, why would this question be so interesting? You know, this kind of trivial sound, huh? And I think one newspaper really got it nice when they said, when our research about this came out, huh? The most important word in the world. And you know, that's not something that we claimed about this word. We did find that, you know, there was something interesting about this word. I want to talk about that research and about a larger research program that was part of. That's what I want to talk about tonight. But I thought that was a really interesting way to think about it. It might well be the most important word in the world. And I want to explain to you why that is. Now, why would you think about words like, huh? Well, for me, it's out of an interest with miscommunication and with communication. You know, it's really about how we understand each other, about mutual understanding. And you know, one way to put it is in the words of Leonard Cohen, who famously sang, "There is a crack in everything," and that's how the light gets in. Now, there's many different ways to read this wonderful song, of course. But one way in which I've started to think about it is as telling us that, you know, it's in how a system breaks down that we really learn something about it. It's through the cracks that we get to see how something really works. And so therefore, what you do when you look at a word like huh, or at other cases of misunderstanding, is really you're exploring language through the cracks of misunderstanding, and you're learning something about how language really works for us as people in the social world. And so that's the tour that I want to take you on for tonight. And to start the tour, I want to start actually in another part of the world, in Ghana, which is where I do fieldwork. So one part of my work is doing fieldwork in a little mountain village in eastern Ghana. That's Ghana, West Africa for you. This is the actual village where I do fieldwork. There's a couple more villages around where they also speak the same language. Go behind the mountains there and they speak a different language already. this is how, it often works in Africa. There's a huge amount of languages in Africa. 1/3 of all the world's languages are spoken in Africa. So for me, that's one reason to be there, to do fieldwork there and learn more about the linguistic diversity there. Now, one of the things I do there is I make recordings. I just make video recordings of people chatting together, doing stuff together. These people here are making palm oil. And this is my, this picture is a couple of years old. You can see that from the fact that this is not an HD camera yet. Nowadays what I do is I go there with my HD camera. All my recordings are video and audio. And I record people talking. Why would you do that? Well, because if you really want to understand language, one of the best places to start is in its most natural ecology, where we use it in everyday conversation. And so that's what I do. I study language in its primary ecology. And now one thing that I heard, I spent a lot of time there and I learned many interesting things about how languages can differ from each other. Tonight though, I want to focus on some of the things that unite languages, that make languages similar all over the world. And I want to give you an example of one of the things I heard there that struck me as oddly familiar. And let me just play this simple audio sample. Okay, let me play that again. So, I don't need to give you the translation for you to be able to tell what happens here, right? You hear something saying something, and then another person going. Okay, now this is of course a Ghanaian language that you've never heard before probably, and yet you see some familiar kind of structure. And what I want to argue is that this particular kind of structure, this little ABA structure here, that's one of the most powerful ways in which we can use language. Really what we see in a simple small word like is we see people use words as tools. Now, we don't normally think of words as tools, right? Often, we tend to think of words as maybe labels that we stick on things. That's a table, there's a chair, and so on. But actually, what I want to convince you of is that words are tools. Tools that you use to do stuff in the social world. Normally, of course, when we think of tools, we think of things like this. Hammers maybe, a canoe, I have an example of a canoe here because, this is one thing. It's a tool invented by humans. It's an actual material thing that helps people do stuff in the material world, right? Like crossing a river. Pretty important, pretty useful. So at some point humanity invented the idea of a canoe, invented ways to work the materials and then made this thing. And that thing helps them make changes in the physical world, cross rivers, for instance. So make things possible that previously were not possible. Now, really what I'm saying when a word like is a tool is it's quite similar to this. It helps you do something that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. Except this tool, of course, is not a material tool. It's a social tool. It's something that helps you do something in the social world. In the case of what we are really doing is we are using it as a tool to mend broken conversations. Because that's really what it is. You say something, I didn't quite catch it, you go, and I repeat it. And of course there are other ways to do this. We don't just use this word, I'll get to that later. But as a first approximation, this is a really, really important word to have in your repertoire. One reason I know it's important is because we do this in a larger comparative project. We are not interested in specifically. We are interested in how people solve misunderstandings. There are so many ways in which we get to misunderstand one another. There can be noise, there can be loud music, there can be, I wasn't paying attention, maybe I was doing something else. You're using words that I don't know. There are very many ways in which communication can go wrong. In fact, it's quite miraculous that it goes right so often. And the reason is not because we are so good. The reason is because we have tools to mend broken conversations. And this is one of them. Now, why do I know that this is that important? Well, because one part of our work is to compare data from different languages. I have this language that I work on in Ghana. Other colleagues work in Ecuador, in China, in Russia, in Australia. And all of us work on everyday conversation. And all of us collect cases of everyday conversation and cases where there are misunderstandings. So here are 12 languages that we studied in our project. From big ones like English and Mandarin Chinese and Russian to really tiny ones like Siwu in Ghana, that's the one I study, or Chapala in Ecuador, and so on. And what we did was just, as time progresses, we checked how often it happens that people get into a misunderstanding like this. How long does it take, in other words, until you encounter one of those things? A word like huh, or sorry, or who, and so on. A clarification request. And so this is a simple graph showing time on the x-axis and then the probability of getting one of those things, which, you know, as a short term, I'll just use repair. The probability of a next repair over time. And this is what it looks like across all those languages. So what you see, I mean, there's many interesting things about this graph, but the most important thing here is really that across all those languages, the average is roughly the same. It's 84 seconds on average. So rarely do 2 minutes go by in any conversation in any language, or we will be asking for clarification. It happens all the time. So another way to summarize is that this is indispensable. Without words and expressions like this, we'd just be stuck all the time. We would get nothing done. We wouldn't be able to communicate. And so this is one way in which actually, you know, these are the cracks through which the light gets in and which gives us a view of the internals of language. This is what helps us communicate. So that's the first lesson. This is a hugely important word. Now, I want to ask you a question, because we have a very diverse audience here, so probably you speak many different languages. I want to ask you for the word for why in your language, just because that's a very common question word. We probably have, you know, lots of different languages here, so, you know, just shout maybe first the language and then the word. So I start for Dutch, okay? Waarom? Dutch.
I have 3 Y's in my name.
Okay, go for it.
Neden, niçin, niye in Turkish.
Okay.
Neden is for what purpose, niye is for what reason.
Wow.
Is
Something else. Something else.
okay. For what cause, for what purpose, for what reason.
That's a beautiful little system right there. But okay, I want to hear more languages. Perché. Language? Italian. That was? Wieso. Yes, Swiss German right there. Whoa. Cool, okay. More? Pourquoi? Uh-huh. Okay, cool. This is amazing, isn't it? Wow, okay. So, you know, did you have one?
Mia, Hungarian.
Okay, beautiful. Wow, so many different ones. And it didn't even sound like the Finnish. Okay.
Yeah, well, it's one language family.
Well, it sounded a bit like it, but quite different still. That's what I mean, yeah. Okay, anyway, so that's the point, right? This is how words are supposed to work. This is how questions are normally are different from each other, you know. There's no guarantee that given a particular question you'll end up with some kind of sound. And here we all have these different sounds. This is one thing that's so interesting about this little word, huh? Because that's the thing we found, is that it's not like that. It's actually, let me just show you. So here we have Ghana, right? So, I mean, one of the 60 languages of Ghana, let me be clear. You heard it yourself. And now here's the rest of the world, just 30 or so languages from around the world. And so what you see is that you have people going, and so on, right? It all sounds basically the same, very different from what we all just heard for why. In some cases we had the same languages, and yet here we have for the words huh, we have something that's extremely similar everywhere. So this struck us as linguists. This is not how language is supposed to work. And so we started wondering why it would be like this. Now, of course, some of you already are wondering, well, is this even a word, right? Maybe it's just some kind of grunt. Maybe it's nothing. And so let me give you 3 reasons this is a word. First of all, children actually have to learn it. Children are born sneezing, crying, all those kinds of things. They're not born saying, huh? You actually have to learn it, like all the other words in your language. That's not trivial, right? So secondly, and related to this, this is not an instinctive grunt. It's actually controlled. It's not like any time you end up in a situation in which you don't understand someone, you instinctively go, huh? It's not like that. We actually have a lot of control over what we do. In fact, I suppose many of us have been taught that we shouldn't even be saying, huh? We should be saying something more polite. Like in Dutch, wat zegt u, or wat zeg je, and so on. Or I'm sorry, and you know, many languages, not all though, we found, but many languages have a polite version of this too. But the point is, this more informal version is found everywhere, and it's basically the same everywhere. And yet, it's not instinctive, but we have control over it. Third reason is that its actual form, even though I'm stressing that it's the same, it's similar everywhere, it is actually subtly different across languages. So Spanish is like e, which happens to be the most frequent vowel in Spanish, whereas in Dutch, it's hè, where you hear this sounds at the beginning, and that's because that sound is part of our regular sound system in Dutch, but not so much in the same way in Spanish. So the word is subtly adjusted to the language, and that's another way in which it's clearly a word, and quite different from, say, sneeze, okay? So, you know, this is a word, yes, but it's also a non-prototypical word. It's one of the very few universal words that we know. We started to worry, of course, about why would this be? And let me just give you a simple metaphor for understanding this. Let's go back to this canoe as a tool to cross a river, you know, right? Okay, so now if you collect canoes from all over the world, you see something like this. All sorts of different models, all sorts of different makes, maybe different decorations, different materials, sizes are somewhat different, and yet there is a basic shape that they all have. Why is that? Well, obviously, of course, because they are in part made for the same purpose. They all need to cross the river, so they need to stay afloat, they need some kind of streamlined shape so that they also go fast, and you know, there's a couple more things that couple more requirements that we have for these kinds of things that make them the same shape. So they sort of converge to the same form, even though some cultures have independently innovated them, right? So it's not like the canoe spread over the whole world. We know actually that it was independently invented across a couple of, in different places across the world. This is exactly what we propose is the case with, huh? So the idea here is that just like a canoe has to sort of adapt to its environment, the water, this little word, huh, has to adapt to the flow of conversation, its own environment. So that's really where it lives, conversation. Let's just think about a couple ways in which conversation is important, in which conversation provides the sort of the selective environment for this little word. First of all, when somebody asks, imagine somebody asks you a question. Okay, so now it's your turn. And we all know the clock is ticking, right? We all know that the longer you wait in answering that question, the more it starts sounding like, oh, you don't actually know the answer, or, you know, you don't want to go out with them, and so on. Stuff like that, right? We all know this. So the clock is ticking, and it's your turn. But now suppose that you didn't actually hear it. So you're put on the spot, and yet you don't know what to say. And also, you've spent precious time already figuring out, what did I say? Wait, what was that? So now, really, as the time goes by, you need to be fast, you don't have anything to say. What you really need is the simplest syllable that is also a question. What is that? It's, of course, huh? That's what it is. So this is the minimal question word. It's perfectly adapted to the flow of conversation. So this is a word shaped by a mechanism that we call in our work convergent cultural evolution. Biologists will know about convergent evolution in biology. This is the same except in the cultural realm. So this is different cultures, different languages converging on the same solution for what is a recurring problem everywhere. Right, so that's the second thing I wanted to say. And quickly now, the third thing is in a way the most amazing thing. Let's look at our relatives, okay, the bonobos. We share many things with them. You know, we share living a social life, sharing our food, a certain interest in sex, social relations, very detailed social networks. There's so many things, basic emotions like fear and anger and threat and so on. We share so many things, and yet there's one thing that you will not find these animals do, and that is go, huh? It's not that physically they wouldn't be able to do this. It's one of the simplest things I just said. But it's that it's not just a physical thing, right? It requires some pretty advanced thinking. What does it require? Let's just think about this for a moment. Well, it requires me recognizing that you tried to say something to me. It also requires me recognizing that I did not quite get what you were trying to say. And it requires me realizing that I can now signal to you that I did not get what you were trying to say. And it requires you to then recursively apply all that knowledge about me not getting it and so on, so as to interpret my simple error signal, huh? And then repeat it. Repeat what you just said. So there's a lot of very advanced thinking going into even a very simple word like this, because it takes getting that you don't get it. And actually, there are not many animals besides us that can do that. getting that you don't get it. Got that? I hope so. So one of the things we learned from this about language is that really, language is quite different from animal communication, from just simple, I mean, it's a form of animal communication, but it's different from the communication of many other animals. It's much more like a game in which we take moves and try to predict what the other is doing, and based on that, change our own moves, and that's how we sort of progress through the game. And like any game, it has rules, of course. And one of the interesting things that we learn from, again, looking through the cracks of this little system here, is we learn something about the unwritten rules of conversation. I'm going to tell you something about conversation that will help you hack conversation, okay? So, let me just walk you through a very simple, basic insight in conversation analysis. And that is, you have a couple options after the first move. So somebody asks you a question. What are your options? First of all, you can give them the right answer. But the other option is, you can say, huh? Or sorry. And the interesting thing is, that's something you can always do, right? That's always an option. Now, suppose you go down that lane. You go for repair. And now, interestingly, we have a similar kind of bifurcation. Namely, you can go, huh? And you can always do that. You don't need to have heard anything. But you could have heard everything. You can still go, huh, whatever the case. Or if you've heard something that they were talking about a person, for instance, you might say, who? Or you mean Joe? Or stuff like that. So you might be a little more helpful. Here's the thing that we found in our research into not just huh, but all these other ways of asking for clarification. We found a universal rule. In all those 12 different societies, remember, all of them had huh, but all of them also have these other ways of asking for repair. And what we found was that people only use huh when they cannot do something else. So whenever possible, when we know that they heard you, then the expectation is that they do not use huh, but they use a more helpful, a more specific tool. So basically, across the globe, what we found is that people are not selfish, are not doing what's easiest for me, just going, huh, let you figure out the problem and solve it. No, what we find is that people, whenever they can, they try to avoid huh for a more specific version. I'm not saying a more polite version. Huh is still very useful when you cannot do anything else. But you go more specific when you can. And this is, by the way, why we feel sometimes that huh is impolite. It's because we feel like, oh, you heard me all right. So, why are you going, huh? That feels really rude. You're wasting both of our time, basically, by going, huh, if you could have done something else. This is why huh is sometimes rude. And still, do not fear. You will be using huh all the time, because there are many situations in which we simply do not hear each other. Okay, so then, to just sum up, I've shown you that this little word is indispensable. I've also shown you that it's universal. And I've shown you that this larger repair system is deeply human. It tells us about who we are as humans. And with this knowledge in hand, we can ask some big questions and get sensible answers. So for instance, take a big question like, what are words? Well, I've tried to convince you that words are not stickers, not abstract labels out there somehow, but they are tools that you use in the social world. What is language? Similarly, language is not like a sign that you hold up and it's saying, here's my thoughts, this is what I'm thinking. No, actually, language is joint action. It's something you do together. It's much more like a game with really intricate moves. And finally, just to make this a little more, a little closer home, how many of you use your phone's Siri or Alexa or Cortana-like function for speaking to your phone and getting answers? Anybody? Any nerds? Any real nerds here? Okay, some of you. Now, I'm actually willing to take a guess that some of you have tried it and found it wanting. They were not happy about how it does. One of the most annoying things about those things right now yet is that they cannot really handle misunderstanding very well. So, one of the ways in which our research is really applicable is in showing the universal ways in which people ask for repair, not just huh, but also other methods, and trying to implement that in AI systems. And that's where I want to stop. And I want to just go back to the very beginning and remind you to always keep asking questions. That's it.
Okay.